Tyrion Lannister had always been different from the rest of his family, not just in his sharp wit or love for books, but in his size. The cruel nickname of the Imp followed him throughout his life, but it was also a source of his strength. Now, imagine a world where Tyrion wasn't born a dwarf, where he had the height and presence of a typical Lannister. How would his life change? Would he still be the same man we came to know and admire in Game of Thrones? Tyrion was born the same way, on the same day, to Tywin and Joanna Lannister, but this time, there was no cruel twist of fate. He was a normal, healthy baby, bigger than Jaime and Cersei at birth, not scorned for his size, but hailed as the future heir of Casterly Rock. His mother smiled as she held him in her arms, and Tywin, though his stern demeanor remained, saw the promise of his line continuing in the boy, not the bitter disappointment he had felt with his dwarf son in the past. As Tyrion grew, the family's expectations of him shifted. There was no need to be cunning, no need to develop the biting humor that would become his shield. He was tall, he was strong, and he was the heir to the Lannister fortune. His father's eyes now held pride, not disdain, and Tyrion felt the weight of his birthright more heavily than ever before. Cersei, however, never stopped being jealous. She had always seen Tyrion as a competitor, even though she hated him for things beyond his control. His new height didn't change that. Now, instead of being an outcast, Tyrion was her equal, her only rival for their father's favor, and she hated that just as much. Jaime, on the other hand, embraced the brotherhood, glad to have a sibling who no longer reminded him of their family's faults. He admired Tyrion's intellect, but there was an underlying tension, a realization that Tyrion might outshine him, not because of his wit, but because he now had everything Jaime had, the looks, the respect, and the legacy. Tyrion spent his childhood not learning to outsmart the world, but training to inherit it. The tutors that once tried to ignite his mind now focused on his swordsmanship and political acumen. He was a young Lannister, growing into a young man, who was destined to lead. Yet despite all this, there was a gnawing feeling in him. Something was missing. His father wanted him to be a perfect ruler. But was that what Tyrion wanted for himself? Was he going to be a Lannister like the others, with no regard for what was right, only what was powerful? When Tyrion finally came of age, Tywin sent him to King's Landing to represent the family, a perfect son destined to succeed his father. Tyrion, now tall and imposing, walked into the capital with the confidence of a man who had always been in control. The small folk didn't see the imp anymore. They saw the lion. But as he settled into the role his father had carved for him, Tyrion's internal conflict began to grow. Was he truly the man he wanted to be? Or was he simply becoming the next in a long line of Lannisters, destined to inherit the same bitterness and cold ambition as his father? With his new stature, Tyrion would not have to face the ridicule and challenges of being a dwarf. He wouldn't have been underestimated by the likes of Varys or the small folk, and perhaps his rise to power would have been faster, more brutal. He wouldn't have been forced to develop the biting wit that had once made him so unique. He would have been a Lannister in every sense, powerful, proud, and potentially just as ruthless as his father. Yet, there was something Tyrion found uncomfortable in all of this. His lack of struggle meant he lacked the experiences that had made him the man who would eventually question his family's values, something his dwarfism had forced him to do. Would he still be that insightful, morally driven man, or would he, like his father, lose touch with the people, the power, and ultimately, his humanity? In this world, Tyrion Lannister would become the heir, the perfect Lannister. But would he be able to survive the very system that had created him? The streets of King's Landing had always been a place of turmoil, where the air reeked of ambition and the cries of the small folk echoed through the alleys. Tyrion, now standing tall and full of Lannister pride, felt no different as he walked through the Red Keep's grand halls. His footsteps no longer held the quiet, careful tread of someone trying to avoid detection. He was no longer a shadow in the background. He was seen, truly seen. The first time he walked into the council chambers, he felt the weight of every eye on him. His father's presence seemed to grow larger with each passing day. Tywin, once a man whose disapproving gaze had haunted Tyrion's childhood, now regarded him with calculated pride. There was no longer the subtle disdain in Tywin's eyes. Tyrion had grown into the lion Tywin had always wanted. He was more than his father's son. He was his heir, the one who would carry on the legacy, restore the Lannisters to their rightful place. But Tyrion could feel the cold bitterness growing inside him. The very thing he had longed for, his father's approval, now felt like a shackle. His father's vision of him was not his own. Tyrion wasn't simply inheriting Casterly Rock or becoming the Lord of the Westerlands. He was inheriting his father's cruelty, his ruthlessness, his complete lack of empathy for the lives of others. The man he had become, the lion who ruled over everything, was not the man he wanted to be. Yet there was little room for rebellion. His father had raised him to be perfect, to be strong. He was a Lannister, through and through. At night, in his private chambers, Tyrion would often stare at his reflection in the mirror. He saw the strong, tall man who was supposed to rule, but the face staring back at him seemed unfamiliar. Gone were the days of reading books by candlelight or talking to the small folk at night. He could no longer rely on his quick wit to win him favor. Now, people expected him to rule with force, to command with the same cold, calculating demeanor as Tywin. But Tyrion was not his father. Tyrion had always valued intellect and compassion over power and manipulation. Yet in this world where he was physically the same as his siblings, he feared he was becoming just like Tywin, someone who saw people not as individuals, but as pieces to be moved in a game of power. Cersei and Jaime's attitudes toward him had changed. There was no longer a sense of superiority in their interactions with him, no underlying resentment because he wasn't their equal in stature. But that didn't mean everything was perfect. Cersei, ever the schemer, saw in Tyrion's rise not a brother, but a threat. She began to doubt his loyalty, her jealousy growing as she realized that Tyrion now had the very qualities their father had always praised. Tyrion's relationships with both siblings had always been complicated, but this new dynamic was far more dangerous. Cersei, the lioness, would fight to maintain control over her family. Jaime, though loyal, knew Tyrion was a force to be reckoned with, a force that could easily overshadow him. In the courts, Tyrion's rise to prominence was swift. He could now speak to nobles as an equal, his size and presence giving him the authority that he had once lacked. The council listened intently as he discussed tactics and politics, no longer dismissing him as the witty dwarf, but as the heir to the Iron Throne. Yet something in his mind lingered. He had always prided himself on his cleverness, his ability to outmaneuver those who underestimated him. But now, with every word that left his lips, he wondered if he was becoming just another arrogant Lannister, using his intellect to manipulate instead of using it to better the realm. The first test of his power came when an uprising broke out in the Riverlands. Tyrion was tasked with leading the military campaign, a responsibility he felt unequipped. For despite his training, the soldiers looked at him not as the dwarf they had once mocked, but as the man they were supposed to follow. And so, Tyrion went into battle, his sharp mind calculating every move, every decision. It was no longer about using words to win. It was about using strength and strategy. He was no longer just the clever imp. He was now the man who could command armies. But war, Tyrion quickly realized, was not as easy as strategy and tactics. There was a human cost, lives that could never be replaced. The faces of the dead haunted him more than any battle plan ever could. His soldiers fought for honor, for the Lannisters, but Tyrion saw them not as pawns in his father's game, but as men and women with families, with hopes and dreams. The guilt began to weigh heavily on him. It wasn't just the lives lost that tortured him, but the realization that he was becoming like his father, disconnected from the people he was supposed to rule. He couldn't shake the feeling that the very power he had gained was slipping away from him, like sand through his fingers. His father's vision for him, his siblings' ambitions, and the demands of the throne. Was this what he truly wanted? Was this the life Tyrion Lannister had always dreamed of? Or was it merely the role that had been thrust upon him because of his size, his heritage, and the family that had defined him? King's Landing had always been a city of shadows, and now Tyrion Lannister found himself cast within them, despite the towering height and the respect that came with it. The power he had inherited seemed to seep into every crevice of the Red Keep, but it felt empty. His intellect, once his greatest weapon, now felt like a tool used only to maintain the expectations of his father and family. The more he succeeded, the more he realized the terrible price of success. He had once craved his father's approval, but now he was starting to fear it. Cersei, always the calculating queen, had not stopped watching him closely. She had no love for Tyrion, but his rise, his becoming the heir, was a constant reminder of what she couldn't achieve herself. While she paraded her beauty and political maneuvering, Tyrion had gained something far more dangerous, Tywin's affection and trust. Tyrion had become the embodiment of everything that had always made Cersei insecure. The male heir, the trusted son, the lion who walked in his father's footsteps. Jaime, though not as overtly hostile as Cersei, began to feel the subtle shift in their relationship. The bond they once shared had been unspoken, rooted in their mutual love for their family and each other. But now, Jaime looked at Tyrion with a kind of distant respect, one that suggested a deep realization. Tyrion was a man to be reckoned with, and that could mean trouble for both of them. Yet Tyrion's path forward felt clouded. His father's expectations, his family's ambitions, and the kingdom's thirst for power were all intertwining into a complex web of obligations. Tyrion had been trained to be the clever one, the strategist, the man who could talk his way out of any situation. But now that he had the power to back his words, the responsibility weighed heavily on him. He was no longer an outsider, the family's shame, but the heir, expected to carry the Lannister legacy. He began to wonder if the power of his stature and position had simply amplified the very traits he had despised in his family. He looked back at the man he had been, the quick-witted dwarf who used his intellect to survive in a world that wanted to crush him. That Tyrion had felt more human, more grounded, despite his pain. The Tyrion he was becoming now felt hollow, a reflection of his father's empire, distant from the people he had once defended. The first major test came when a noble house from the Reach, House Tyrell, sent emissaries to King's Landing to discuss an alliance. The Tyrells, having gained control of Highgarden after Mace Tyrell's sudden death, were eager to align themselves with the Lannisters. Tyrion, now firmly seated at his father's side, was tasked with handling the negotiations. He had grown, adept at playing the game of politics, at speaking with authority, but in his gut, he felt something gnawing at him. The Tyrells weren't as naive as they appeared. They had no interest in truly aligning with the Lannisters. They were simply looking for an opportunity to gain leverage. Tyrion knew that. He had always known how to read people, to see the cracks in their facades. But in the past, he had relied on his size, on the way people underestimated him, to gain an advantage. Now, he was not just a man playing a game of survival. He was a man with power, and that power came with its own set of dangers. As the negotiations dragged on, Tyrion found himself staring at the Tyrell emissary, a young noble who had tried to charm his way into Tyrion's favor. He was no longer the imp that could be dismissed with a laugh or a cruel remark. He was now the son of Tywin Lannister, a lion in his own right, but Tyrion could see something else in the emissary's eyes. A quiet assessment, a deep distrust. The Tyrells were playing a long game, and they had no intention of letting a Lannister dictate their future. The realization hit him hard. He had become just another player in a game where no one truly won. The Lannisters had always manipulated others to rise, but Tyrion had once fought for something more, something different. He had wanted to be a man who used his intellect to protect those who had been wronged, not to build his own empire. Tyrion's internal battle grew more intense with each passing day. He was no longer the underdog, but that was the very thing that had made him special. Now, as a tall, powerful Lannister, he was part of a system that perpetuated the very injustices he had once despised. A subtle anger began to grow within him. His sharp mind, once used to carve out small victories against the cruelty of his family, was now being used to perpetuate the same cruelty. He could hear his father's voice echoing in his head, reminding him that power was everything. But was it? Tyrion's experiences had always taught him that true power wasn't about domination. It was about empathy, about understanding the value of people's lives beyond their titles. He had once been proud of his ability to change the course of events with nothing but words, with nothing but his wit. But now, his every move seemed calculated, driven by the very ambition he had once mocked. Was this who he had always been destined to become? The next few weeks were filled with tension. The Tyrell alliance was secured, but Tyrion's mind remained a storm of contradictions. He had played his part well, but it didn't feel like a victory. His rise had been so quick, so forceful, that he hadn't noticed the subtle changes within himself. As the months passed, Tyrion began to withdraw more and more. He spent long nights in his chambers, thinking about what had become of him. His mind, once a tool for survival, now felt like a prison, shackling him to the very system that had never valued him. He had wanted to rise above it, but now it seemed like there was no way out. The war for power raged on quietly in the halls of the Red Keep, but Tyrion found himself no longer part of the game, at least not in the way he used to be. As a child, he had learned that words, not swords, could win battles, and he had used his mind as a weapon to navigate a world that constantly tried to crush him. But now, in the seat of power, words alone felt insufficient. The more power he gained, the more he began to feel disconnected from his roots, from the very things that had once made him proud. Cersei's schemes grew more dangerous with each passing day. She was not content with simply being the queen. She wanted more. She wanted control of the Iron Throne, and Tyrion knew it. What once had been sibling rivalry now felt like a deadly game of survival. The deeper he delved into the politics of Westeros, the more he realized that Cersei had always been the greater Lannister. Her ambition, her ruthlessness, it was what set her apart. Tyrion had been fighting for approval, for validation, while Cersei fought for power itself. Jaime, too, had started to distance himself. Once his closest ally, the brother who had always been there to share a drink and a laugh, now seemed like a distant memory. Tyrion understood. Jaime was bound by his own honor, by his love for Cersei, and as Tyrion grew more and more like their father, Jaime began to see him not as a brother, but as a threat. It was strange. This power he had fought so long for had come with such a price. He had longed for a life where he wasn't defined by his dwarfism, where he could stand tall among the greats. Now, he realized that standing tall had cost him everything that had made him human. One evening, as Tyrion walked through the halls of the Red Keep, he caught a glimpse of himself in the polished windows. The reflection was not of the man he had once imagined himself to be, but of a man he didn't recognize. His face, once marked by the sharp wit and cunning of the imp, was now set in an expression of quiet calculation. His tall form, once a symbol of the freedom he'd never had, now only served as a reminder of what he had lost. He wasn't the quick-witted dwarf anymore. He was just another Lannister. The streets of King's Landing seemed distant now. The small folk no longer mattered. He had become a part of the system he once sought to avoid. His father's legacy, the very thing he had once hated, now surrounded him. Tyrion had become his father, cold, calculating, ruthless. He had become everything he had despised. His nights were restless, filled with thoughts of his past life, of the days when he had been a clever, resourceful man who fought for justice in his own way. But those days felt like a distant dream. He was now a figurehead of power, expected to carry the weight of the Lannister name with pride. But every time he looked into the eyes of those around him, he saw the emptiness of it all. Was this really what he had wanted? Was this the life he had fought for? A particular night was the turning point. Tyrion sat alone in his chambers, a goblet of wine in hand, his mind swirling with regret. He looked out of the window at the lights of King's Landing flickering in the distance, a city built on lies, deceit, and ambition. The city had shaped him, molded him into the man he was now, and yet, in that moment, Tyrion realized how far he had fallen. The door creaked open, and his father entered, as imposing as ever. Tywin Lannister was not a man who often spoke of feelings, nor was he a man to offer comfort. But tonight, as Tyrion sat in his chair, the wine glass half empty, Tywin didn't speak immediately. For the first time, Tyrion saw his father not as a ruler or a patriarch, but as a man who had forged a legacy out of blood and sacrifice, who had never known a world beyond his ambition. "You've done well, Tyrion," Tywin said, his voice steady but laced with something Tyrion couldn't place. Was it approval, or was it just the words of a father who had no other way to speak to his son? Tyrion looked at him, searching for the truth in his father's eyes. "What do you want from me, father?" he asked quietly. "You've got what you wanted. You've turned me into something I didn't want to be." Tywin's expression didn't change. "I want you to be what the family needs, Tyrion. That's what matters. You've always known that." Tyrion stood up suddenly, slamming his goblet onto the table. "I used to think I knew what mattered. But now, I don't know who I am anymore. I'm not the man I wanted to be. I'm just another Lannister puppet, playing the game, becoming the monster I once hated." For a moment, there was silence between them. Tywin didn't offer words of comfort, didn't reassure him. He simply stood there, watching his son as though he were a chess piece on the board. "Don't let sentiment cloud your judgment, Tyrion," Tywin said finally. "In this world, power is the only thing that matters. Don't forget that." As his father left the room, Tyrion sat down heavily in his chair. The weight of his words pressed on him like 1,000 stones. What had he become? The power he had longed for, the approval he had chased, now felt like a cage, and the man he had always been, the imp, the outsider, the intellectual, felt like a distant memory. Tyrion knew there was no way out. Not now, not ever. He had risen, but in doing so, he had lost everything that had made him human. Days passed, but Tyrion felt the burden of his position heavier with each sunrise. The Red Keep was a maze of politics and power games, each corner cloaked in shadows, and he was now trapped in it. His father had made it clear that power was everything, but as Tyrion looked out over the city from his chamber, he wondered if it was worth it. What had he gained? A title? Respect? Fear? Or had he simply traded his soul for the illusion of success? Every time he sat at the council table, the weight of his decisions felt more pressing. The nobles, the small folk, the men and women who depended on him, they all looked to him for leadership. But all Tyrion could think about was the emptiness inside him. He wasn't just playing the game, he had become the game. He had become a cog in a machine that chewed up everyone in its path, leaving nothing but the cold, ruthless pursuit of power. The morning after his conversation with Tywin, Tyrion awoke with a sudden clarity, one that hit him like a hammer to the chest. He couldn't keep pretending that he was the man he wanted to be. He had chosen the path of ambition, not out of some noble desire to protect the realm, but because he had wanted to prove himself, to show everyone that he was more than his size, more than the label they had put on him. But the man who had walked into that council room had nothing in common with the young boy who once sought wisdom and justice. He had been shaped by his family's legacy, by their bloodlust and ambition. In a way, he had become the perfect Lannister, brilliant, calculating, and ruthless. But deep inside, Tyrion knew he was suffocating. The next council meeting was set to begin. As Tyrion entered the grand hall, his eyes met the faces of the other members, noble lords and ladies, generals and advisors. They all waited for his word, for his input. He was the one who now held the power, who dictated the course of Westeros. The council was there to do his bidding, to follow his lead. He could feel their eyes on him, filled with both reverence and fear. But all Tyrion could see was a reflection of his own uncertainty. The confident heir, the man who had once believed in the power of intellect and wit, now felt like a shadow of himself. He had never wanted to be a tyrant. He had never wanted to be his father. Yet here he was, standing among the powerful, and for the first time, he wasn't sure what was worse, his father's expectations or his own emptiness. The discussion began, and Tyrion's mind wandered. He spoke, as always, with precision and sharpness, but his words felt hollow. He felt like a puppet, pulling strings that had been set in motion long before he ever took his place in the council. It wasn't just his father's voice in his head now, it was his own, and his inner voice whispered words he couldn't ignore. "What have you become?" The meeting dragged on, and Tyrion felt the weight of the decisions piling up. Every move he made seemed to be just one more step further from the man he had hoped to be. He could almost hear the echoes of his younger self, the man who had once believed in justice, in the power of his mind. But that man felt so distant, so far removed from the cold, powerful figure he had become. It wasn't just his father's influence that held him prisoner. It was his own choices, his own ambitions. Every time he made a decision, he could feel the chains tightening around him, drawing him further into the very thing he had fought against. Cersei's presence loomed over him more than ever. She was watching, always watching. The subtle rivalry between them had become a dangerous game, one that Tyrion knew could only end in betrayal. The moment she saw a weakness, she would strike. It was only a matter of time. But was it really Cersei he feared, or was it the realization that she too had become a product of the system that had shaped them all? Jaime too had begun to withdraw. The bond they shared, once inseparable, built on love and loyalty, now felt strained. Jaime had always been his protector, his ally in the chaos of the Lannister family. But as Tyrion grew more like their father, Jaime seemed to sense the shift. Tyrion had become a man driven by ambition, not justice. And for Jaime, that was a line he couldn't cross. One evening, after a particularly difficult council meeting, Tyrion stood on the balcony overlooking the city. The moon hung low in the sky, casting its pale light over the city of kings, a city built on deceit and power. He could hear the distant sounds of life below, the cries of the small folk, the sounds of traders and soldiers, the bustling of a city that never slept. And yet, in the silence of his solitude, Tyrion felt more alone than he ever had in his life. It was then that he realized the terrible truth. He had become exactly what he feared. The lion he had always despised was not his father, but himself. Tyrion had spent so long fighting for respect, for a place at the table, that he had forgotten what truly mattered. He had gained everything and lost himself in the process. He was no longer the clever, compassionate man who had wanted to make the world a better place. He was just another Lannister, another player in a game that had no winners, only survivors. Tyrion knew that he couldn't undo what had been done. His choices had led him to this point, and now there was no turning back. But for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of the man he used to be, a man who had once dared to think for himself, to question the system, to believe that there was more to life than power. And yet, that flicker was faint, as if it were buried beneath the weight of all his decisions, all the lives he had changed and crushed along the way. Tyrion was a lion now, but he had no pride, no joy. He was just a man trapped in a game of his own making, with no way out. The days blurred together in a haze of meetings, schemes, and whispers. Tyrion had learned early on that power was a slow burn, but now, with it all at his fingertips, he found it exhausting. Every choice he made seemed to lead to another crossroad, another lie to cover up, another person to betray. Each day he felt more and more like a man who had swallowed a bitter truth, a truth that whispered in the back of his mind. There was no turning back now. Cersei's ambitions grew more dangerous, and Tyrion felt the sharp edge of her jealousy more acutely with each passing day. Their rivalry had always been poisoned, but now it had taken a darker turn. The careful balance of the family was shifting, and Tyrion knew it was only a matter of time before Cersei made her move. She had always been a master of manipulation, but now, with the full weight of the Lannister name behind her, she was a dangerous adversary. Jaime, too, had become more distant. The bond they had once shared, forged in childhood, and strengthened in battle, seemed to have frayed at the edges. Tyrion knew Jaime loved him, but love had its limits, and ambition had begun to strain their relationship. Jaime's loyalty had always been to Cersei, but Tyrion had never imagined it would come to this, a point where even his brother would have to choose sides. Tyrion's nights were filled with restless thoughts. The wine no longer brought the numbness it once had, and sleep became an elusive comfort. His mind was too sharp, too aware of the weight of his actions. He couldn't silence the voice that whispered in his ear, telling him that he was just as guilty as his father, that his rise to power was built on the same cruel foundations. But there was another voice, a voice that fought against the darkness creeping into his soul, a voice that reminded him of who he used to be, the Tyrion who had questioned authority, who had seen the flaws in the world and tried to change them, the Tyrion who had once believed in justice, in a world where intellect and compassion could conquer cruelty. But that man felt far away now, a distant memory of a time when he had believed there was a chance for something better. The tipping point came when the kingdom faced a rebellion in the Reach. House Tyrell had grown bold, their desire for more power becoming evident. Tyrion had dealt with them before, with subtlety and diplomacy, but this time it was different. This time, there was no room for clever words. The rebellion had to be crushed, and it had to be done quickly. Tywin had always insisted that brute force was the answer when diplomacy failed, and Tyrion, despite his inner reservations, was forced to follow his father's path. He stood in the war room, his hands clenched into fists as the map of the Reach lay spread before him. The generals around him spoke of strategy, of soldiers, of blood. Tyrion could see the faces of the men who would die, the families that would mourn them, but there was no room for sentiment. There was no room for compassion. The Lannisters needed this victory, and Tyrion knew that if he faltered, it would be his family's undoing. "Make sure it's decisive," Tywin's voice echoed in the room, cold and final. "No mercy." Tyrion nodded, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like a vice. He wasn't just following his father's orders now, he was commanding the army, dictating the fate of thousands of lives. For the first time, he understood the true cost of ambition. Power didn't just change who you were, it changed what you were willing to sacrifice. The battle was swift and brutal. Tyrion sat at the war table, listening to reports of victory. The Tyrell forces were crushed, their rebellion quelled. Yet as the cheers rang through the halls, Tyrion felt nothing. His heart, once stirred by the hope that he could make a difference, now felt like stone. The soldiers, the peasants, the families who had lost everything, they were just numbers now. Casualties in a game of thrones. He had become just like his father, cold, ruthless, and indifferent. Later that night, as Tyrion sat alone in his chamber, the echoes of the battle still reverberating in his mind, he heard a knock on the door. He didn't need to ask who it was. He could sense his brother's presence. Jaime entered, his face drawn, his eyes filled with something Tyrion couldn't quite read. "We won," Jaime said flatly, his voice devoid of triumph. But at what cost? Tyrion looked up at his brother, the man who had once been his closest confidant. "At the cost of everything," he replied quietly. "What have I become, Jaime?" Jaime didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a seat across from Tyrion, his gaze distant. "You've become who you always feared, Tyrion. A Lannister, a lion. But I don't know if that's who you truly are." Tyrion laughed bitterly. "It doesn't matter anymore. I've made my choices. I can't undo them." Jaime's eyes softened. "You could, if you wanted to." Tyrion shook his head. "It's too late for that." For a long moment, there was only silence between them. The bond they once shared felt like it had been stretched too thin, and Tyrion couldn't tell if they were still brothers or just two men caught in the same struggle for power. The world outside had changed, and so had they. Tyrion had become the very thing he had once despised, and there was no going back. The next day, the celebration of victory was in full swing. But Tyrion couldn't join in. He couldn't stomach the cheers, the smiles, the revelry. He had won the battle, but at what cost? His soul? His humanity? The more he thought about it, the more he realized that winning had never been the goal. The goal had always been to survive, to prove himself. But in doing so, he had lost the very thing that had made him different, the very thing that had set him apart from his family. Tyrion Lannister had always been the outsider, the one who didn't belong. Now he wasn't just a part of the Lannister legacy. He was the very embodiment of it, the ambition, the cruelty, the indifference to the lives of others. And as he looked out over the city, his heart heavy with the knowledge that there was no escape from the life he had chosen, he realized the cruelest truth of all. Tyrion Lannister had become his father's son. The days following the Tyrell rebellion were marked by a strange kind of emptiness. The streets of King's Landing echoed with the sounds of celebration, but Tyrion could hear none of it. His thoughts were too loud, too overwhelming. Every victory, every triumph, had come at a cost he couldn't ignore anymore. His father's voice, once a source of pride, now sounded like a constant whisper in his mind. Power, legacy, blood. Cersei had grown even more arrogant in the wake of the victory. She paraded around the Red Keep, smug in her belief that her brother was the one who had secured the win, her pride swelling as she basked in the glow of success. But Tyrion could see through her. He knew her game all too well. She wanted more. She always wanted more. And the more she gained, the more dangerous she became. Jaime, on the other hand, had grown more distant. It wasn't just the battle or the war that had pushed them apart. It was the realization that Tyrion had changed. The brother Jaime had once known, the clever, compassionate man who fought for justice, for the good of the realm, had disappeared. In his place stood a man who cared little for the cost of power, who followed in Tywin's footsteps without question. Jaime had tried to reach him, tried to remind him of who he used to be, but Tyrion had grown deaf to his pleas. It wasn't that he didn't care about Jaime. It was that Tyrion didn't know who he was anymore. His identity, once so clear, had become clouded with the weight of his choices. He was no longer the outsider, the clever dwarf who outsmarted his enemies. He was just another Lannister, a player in a game where no one was innocent. One cold evening, Tyrion found himself alone in the gardens of the Red Keep, staring at the stars above. He could hear the sounds of the castle behind him, the faint laughter of courtiers and nobles, but in the stillness of the night, he felt disconnected from it all. It wasn't just the victory he had won, it was the price of that victory. The people had cheered, but it was their blood that had spilled to secure it. And for what? A title? A legacy? A family that had always used him as a pawn in their endless game for power? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching from behind. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Jaime's presence had always been unmistakable, and even now Tyrion could feel the weight of his brother's gaze. "You're out here again," Jaime said quietly, stopping a few paces behind Tyrion. "I don't know what you're looking for, Tyrion, but it's not out here. It's inside you." Tyrion didn't respond. He didn't have the strength to argue anymore. Jaime was right, but he didn't know how to fix what was broken. He had always been able to outthink his enemies, to manipulate the game in his favor. But now, the game felt meaningless. He had no answers for the emptiness inside him. Jaime sighed and took a step closer. "I don't recognize you anymore, little brother. You've become a shadow of our father. You've become someone I never wanted you to be." Tyrion's heart ached at his words, but he couldn't deny their truth. He had become everything he had once feared, everything he had fought against. His ambition had consumed him. His desire to prove himself, to rise above the hatred and disdain, had turned him into a man who cared more about power than about the lives of those around him. "I didn't choose this, Jaime," Tyrion said, his voice low, almost broken. "I wanted something better, something different, but now I'm just like him. I'm just like Tywin." Jaime didn't say anything for a long while. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost pitying. "You are not him, Tyrion. You've always been different. But you've let this world change you. You've let them shape you into something. You're not, and that's not your fault. But it is your choice whether you keep going down this path." Tyrion turned to face his brother, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and sorrow. "What choice do I have, Jaime? I've gone too far. I've made too many decisions. I've crossed lines that can't be uncrossed." Jaime stepped closer, his hand resting on Tyrion's shoulder. "You always had a choice, Tyrion. You still do. But you need to remember who you are. Not the Lannister heir, not the man your father wanted you to be. You need to remember the man you once were." Tyrion looked up at the sky, his eyes searching for an answer he didn't have. He wanted to believe his brother, wanted to believe that there was still a way out of this, but he didn't know how to escape the life he had built for himself. Power was a prison, and he had locked himself inside. The next morning, as Tyrion stood before the council, ready to make the decisions that would shape the future of Westeros, he realized just how far gone he was. His father's words echoed in his mind. Power, legacy, blood. They were no longer just words. They were his reality. He was no longer the clever imp who outwitted his enemies. He was the man who commanded armies, who made decisions that affected the lives of thousands. And the more power he gained, the more he lost himself. Cersei watched him from across the room, her eyes cold and calculating. She was waiting for him to make a mistake, waiting for the moment when his ambition would finally break him. And Tyrion knew she was right to watch. He had become just like their father, a man who cared more for his own legacy than for the people. He ruled. Jaime's words echoed in his mind once more. You still have a choice, Tyrion. You always have. But the choice didn't seem real anymore. The power was too great, the pull of ambition too strong. He had made his bed, and now he had to lie in it. There was no going back, no way to undo the man he had become. As Tyrion looked around the council chamber, he realized that the lion's heart he had once admired was no longer something to aspire to. It was a curse, and in his quest for power, he had allowed himself to become the very thing he had once feared. The days dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Tyrion Lannister had reached the pinnacle of power, but in doing so, he had lost the one thing that had once mattered to him: his soul. He had become the man he had feared, a man who ruled not through wisdom, but through fear and manipulation. The legacy of his father, Tywin Lannister, had taken root deep inside him, and there was no escaping it. King's Landing had become a prison to him. The people cheered for the victories he had secured, but Tyrion knew better than anyone that their cheers were hollow. Cheers were hollow. They didn't see the bloodshed, the cost of his ambition. All they saw was the power he wielded, the name he carried, and it was that name that had condemned him. The world had always been a game to the Lannisters. To Tyrion, it had been a way to survive, to prove that he was more than his size, more than the scorn he had received from his family and society. But now, as he stood on the precipice of his greatest victory, he realized how little it had all meant. He had won the respect of his father, but at what cost? His father was dead, and Tyrion was left standing in the ashes of a life that had been built on lies. He had sought to become his own man, to rise above the expectations placed on him. But in the end, he had become just another Lannister. Power-hungry, cold, and ruthless. The very things he had once despised in his family had taken root inside him. Cersei's ambitions had grown, but now even she was starting to show cracks in her armor. She saw Tyrion as a rival, as a threat to her claim to the throne. She had always wanted to be queen, but now, with Tyrion as the power behind the throne, she knew she had to make her move. Tyrion was no fool. He could see her plotting, could feel the tension between them growing. Jaime, too, had changed. The bond they had once shared, brothers, confidants, had frayed beyond repair. Jaime had tried to reach him, tried to remind him of the man he used to be. But it was too late. Tyrion had fallen too far into the web of power to ever escape it. His choices had led him to this moment, and now there was no way to undo them. One night, as Tyrion sat in his chambers, staring out over the darkened city, he felt the weight of his decisions bearing down on him. His father's words echoed in his mind once more: power, legacy, blood. It was all that mattered now. He had become the very thing he had once fought against. He heard a knock at the door, and before he could respond, the door creaked open. It was Jaime. The man who had always stood by him, the one person who had never abandoned him, was now standing in front of him, looking at him with a mix of pity and sorrow. "I don't know what you've become, Tyrion," Jaime said softly, his voice heavy with sadness. "I don't recognize you anymore." Tyrion's heart twisted in his chest. He had always feared this moment, feared the day when Jaime would see him not as his brother, but as the man he had become, the man he had never wanted to be. "I've become what I needed to be," Tyrion replied bitterly. "A Lannister. Nothing more." Jaime shook his head. "No, Tyrion. You were never just a Lannister. You were always more than that. But you've let this world change you." Tyrion's laughter was cold, bitter. "What choice did I have, Jaime? This world doesn't care about what I want. It only cares about power. And now I have it." Jaime stepped closer, his eyes filled with pain. "You had a choice. You always did. But now, Now you're just another Lannister, just another man who's lost himself in the game. Tyrion stood up, his fists clenched at his sides. What would you have me do, Jaime? Give it all up? Step down from the power that's rightfully mine? Let Cersei take what I've earned? Jaime's gaze softened, but there was a steeliness to it. You could still change, Tyrion. It's not too late. But you have to choose who you want to be. Tyrion's mind was a storm of contradictions. He wanted to believe Jaime, wanted to believe that there was still a chance for redemption. But he knew deep down that the man he had become was beyond saving. He had made too many choices, crossed too many lines. There was no coming back from this. The next morning, Tyrion woke to the sounds of chaos outside. The city was in turmoil, whispers of rebellion spreading like wildfire. The small folk, once loyal to the Lannisters, were now turning against them. They had seen the bloodshed, the cruelty, and they were no longer willing to stand idly by. The Lannisters had ruled through fear, and now that fear had turned to anger. Tyrion stood at the window, looking out over the city that had once been his kingdom. He saw the fires burning in the streets, the people rioting, and he knew that it was all coming to an end. His rise to power had been swift, but it had come at a terrible cost. The very people he had once ruled over were now calling for his downfall. He could feel it in his bones. The end was near. The Lannister name, once so powerful, was crumbling before his eyes. His family, his legacy, all of it was falling apart. And in that moment, Tyrion realized something. Power, ambition, legacy, they were all illusions. He had spent his entire life chasing after something that had never been real. He had sought to prove his worth, to show the world that he was more than a dwarf. But now, as he stood at the edge of everything, he understood the truth. He was just another man. A man who had been consumed by his own ambition. As the sounds of rebellion grew louder, Tyrion knew that there was no escape. His fall was inevitable. He had played the game and lost. He had become the very thing he had feared. And now, the lion's roar was fading, lost in the winds of change. Tyrion had risen, but now he would fall. And when he did, there would be no one left to mourn him but the ghosts of his past.